Okay, we're going to restart. I promised you that we would work you hard, but it doesn't look like you mind it. We're going to move into kind of a different key right now. This is more of a hands-on skill session with journalists to give you some basic grassroots ideas of how to use some of the information that you're getting and you will get. And leading the session is Al Cross. I introduced him last night to you guys. I don't think we could have brought off this conference quite so successfully without Al's help. He's a fundamental, I'm not sure what the word would be, but a player, cog element in what drives rural journalism and small-town journalism, small-city journalism today. He is a director, as you know, of the Institute of Rural Journalism and Community Issues. He's a seasoned journalist, 25 years as a columnist in Louisville. You can read his full bio. I'm not going to waste a lot of time just talking about it because it would take me probably most of the afternoon. But he's been a real help, an advisor, and a counsel, not only for this conference, but in other conferences we've had. So, Al, the floor is yours, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you very much, Steve. You know, we got a lot of great information this morning, and now we're going to shift gears and say, okay, what do we do with it? And what other sorts of information are there, and how do we go about reporting it? And on our panel, we have a fellow who's very familiar with the data, Jack Norton. Someone who's reported at the state level on criminal justice reforms in Kristine Phillips. And we have Juleyka Lantigua-Williams, who has a great project funded by the MacArthur Foundation, first crack out of the box on a grant application, to do a podcast about these issues. And she's going to talk about that kind of reporting and the various places she's been to. But at the start, I wanted to reflect a little bit on what we heard this morning, because as soon as I heard the first panel, the first set of speakers, I realized I needed to write a story about this for the Rural Blog and our ruraljournalism.org website. And I think you might want to consider doing likewise, because that'll provide background for your local reporting, not just as background for your readers and listeners, but for yourself. I think reviewing and reflecting on this material can help you develop story ideas and reporting approaches. And there were really great quotes this morning. I just want to share my impressions of them. Chris Henriksen said, "Mass incarceration has metastasized from the largest cities to almost every community in America." Judge Leifman said 80% of the solution is at the local level. That tells me maybe 80% of the journalism ought to be at the local level too. He also said, "There's something very wrong with a society that is willing to spend more money to incarcerate people than to treat them." And he added, "This is a horrible, horrible, shameful American tragedy, and it must be reversed." Sheriff Larry Amerson said, "I never thought I'd be an advocate for the mentally ill." And he added later, "We're elected by the people to serve them." What he meant was, we're elected to serve all the people, not just those who can make a difference politically. And he added, with some personal testimony about overdoses in his family, we're not just arresting them, we're rescuing them. Cherise Burdine gave us a lot of essential facts about the pretrial system, and this good quote, "If you want to have the biggest impact in a small amount of time, you change your bail practices." Larry Mays said, "Jails suffer from political conservatism in rural counties, but they also suffer from fiscal conservatism." Kirk Taylor had a good one. He said, "Didn't we get rid of debtors' prisons like in the Middle Ages?" Well, it was later than that, but good point, Sheriff. He also reminded us to follow the money, which not only reveals the motivation for how local governments handle these issues, but to take a closer look at the political contributions, lobbying, and connections of the commercial bail bond industry, which I think is one of the least reported on industries in this country. You know, follow the money has always been a maxim in political reporting. That reminded me that these issues need to be asked about in races for sheriff, prosecutor, judge, legislator, and local and state executives. If you want to raise the profile of this issue, make it part of your political reporting. One of the more important points, I think, this morning was that no one entity is responsible for this problem. So you have to persevere and talk to a lot of different people. As Cherise said, you will eventually find someone who has been to a conference and is beginning to understand. Those of you who are from really rural areas know that the people who really understand the depth of this problem, the breadth of the problem, are probably few and far between. But they are out there. And just takes a little extra reporting to find them. The sheriffs talk very helpfully about the need to have a level of trust. And I think one way to do that is to demonstrate that you understand the problems facing these officials by doing profiles of them. I think Cherise may have suggested that. A profile is one of the best ways I know to turn a subject into a source. The jailers are where the rubber meets the road, and that's where you will need to do much of your reporting. Larry Mays warned us that jailers can be very receptive or very skeptical, and I think they tend to be the latter. When we did a statewide project in Kentucky in 2004 to see how well local officials complied with open records laws, the jailers were the least cooperative. All we wanted was the jail log, who all had been booked in. And about a fourth of them wouldn't comply. By the way, we still elect our jailers in Kentucky. I think we're the only state where that is an elective office. Cherise and Judge Leifman also testified to the value of journalism about these subjects, not just for getting public attention and policymakers' response, but the education of people within the system. The judge said, we need to be educated as well, that we're doing it the wrong way. And journalism plays a role in doing that. So let's get to the journalism. Jack, you're the data person in this group, so I would like you to show off the great data gathering that the Vera Institute has done, including the revelation of the rising incarceration rates in rural counties.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Norton. I'm a researcher at the Vera Institute of Justice. And Al said I am a data guy, but I work with a team at Vera, most of whom are much better with data than I am. But I want to talk about, so what I do at Vera is needs to go up? Yeah, it's always my problem with these things. I'm a qualitative researcher at Vera. My background, I'm a geographer, about done with a PhD in human geography. And what I do at Vera is kind of like walks the line between journalism and sort of ethnography and research. And it's nice to be in this room with all of you. And what I do is I use the data as a starting point most of the time for sort of more in-depth research into some of counties and rural counties. So this is the Incarceration Trends Project or website at Vera. It's a great resource. And it will give you, what they did at Vera with the ITP, we call it, is they stitched together county-level incarceration data from 1970 to the present. So we can see trends for each county, and we can also see that data in sort of a national and state context. And there's a bunch of data points you can look at. There's incarceration rate, there's pretrial rate. So I was a fellow at Vera in 2016 with this. And where I started doing the work that I'm doing now is in Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania. And I started, we were looking at this map, and I think it was Chris in the back. We were just interested in Lackawanna County. Lackawanna County is where Scranton, Pennsylvania is. Pretty rural. Scranton's not a rural place, but it's a small city, right? So I look at rural counties and small cities. And so if we look at this is what you can do. You can look at a map, you see Lackawanna County. If Chris clicks on the full profile, you'll see that that's the jail incarceration rate for Lackawanna County in 2015 was 680.2, and that's per population 15 to 65. And then underneath, you can see, what is that, the state line and the national line. So the question that we had out of this was, like, what is going on in Scranton, Pennsylvania? Like, why are there so many people in jail, like 2.5 hours or 3 hours, whatever it is, outside of New York City, where New York City's incarceration rate has been dropping during this time, where you see Scranton sort of going. So what did we find out there? I'll just be quick about it. I want to talk about Scranton, and then I'll talk about a piece that we just released. So a lot of the stuff I do is, like I said, using the data as a starting point and then sort of generating questions from it. And so I guess what I would want to impart to everybody, and a lot of you probably already know this, is like the importance of looking at this jail data in a very broad socioeconomic and political context. And what I mean is, I think it's very important to see the jail not just as a technical problem, but as a social and political problem. So looking at economic indicators, looking at race relations in some of these places, and trying to like figure out what is the jail's place in the broader context, whether it's in the county or the state. That's one thing. So to give an example, Scranton, as you may know, is a deindustrialized town. They've lost tons of manufacturing jobs, et cetera, right? The other thing about what I do in terms of going into places with these high rates, there are a couple things. One is who I would consider stakeholders in the criminal justice system. I try to take as wide of a view of that as possible in the research and writing. So, for example, it's like, who are the stakeholders in the Scranton jail? Well, obviously, it's the people that work in the jail, right? You've got the sheriff, you've got the guards, you've got the police in Scranton, et cetera. And then you have people that have been in and out of jail, or people that are currently in jail. But we try to think of, like, in some of these rural counties, the stakeholders, the people that would have an opinion that matters about jail incarceration or criminal justice issues, would pretty much be like anybody living in the county, right? Anybody who is paying for this. And those opinions matter. And the opinions that matter also have to do with, like, do you want a jail? Or, like, do you want a bigger jail? Like, so. Hang on a sec, let me stay at Scranton. The other thing, for the data is, when you're looking at this data, one thing you need to look at is, like, if they're holding people for other counties. And, like, as an example, Scranton, I don't know it off the top of my head, but the Lackawanna County Jail, I think it was 1999, built an expansion, right? They built their jail out expressly, or I don't know if I can say expressly, but it was told to me that, like, they built it to take advantage of being able to hold prisoners for the federal marshals, for example, so that they could get that revenue in and offset their budget for the jail, right? And so that's one thing that you look for in the data, as you can see. And it's one thing to think about in terms of, like, a rural place or a small city, in terms of, like, what's going on with criminal justice, or how do people think about police and incarceration when they're making investments at the county level into increased incarceration, even if it's for federal prisoners. Let me quickly just talk about a piece that we released today, like an hour ago, on Glades County. And I haven't really looked at the rate. Can we look at Glades County? So, in terms of starting off from the data, Glades County, it's below there, it's south. Glades County is in what used to be the northern Everglades before they drained most of that in the 20s and 30s and started to grow sugarcane. So if we look at Glades County, it has an incredibly high rate, right? It goes up to 4,000, over 4,000 per 100,000 people between the ages of 15 and 64. So that was the starting point, right? And it's just a starting point. So on further sort of investigation, what we realized is Glades County was approached by, at the time, INS and later ICE in the early 2000s to build out an enormous county jail to be used as an immigrant detention center. Oh yeah, there it is. It just got launched. So that's the starting point. And quickly, I mean, I'd encourage you to read this piece, but I guess the importance for me of this piece is, yes, look at these high incarceration, especially if the rate is like very, very high. You want to think about other authorities, and you want to think about different levels of government. So in this case, what I find really interesting with Glades is you have basically the federal government encouraging at the county level to build out this huge jail. How they paid for it is very interesting. They created a nonprofit, the county did, which then bonded out to build this huge jail, which in effect linked the county's politics to immigrant detention, if that makes sense. Because after they built this jail out, the county had an interest, if not a direct financial interest, a political interest in keeping their county jail open and paying the bonds. And the way to do that was to keep immigrant detainees coming in. And they had a problem during the Obama administration. They weren't getting enough immigrant detainees. And if you read the local papers there from those years, you see there's like a lot of concern among county officials, like, why aren't we getting enough people for ICE? We need to talk to ICE. We need more detainees. There was a lot of support for Trump in the county before he was elected, based on Trump's rhetoric and the county officials thinking, okay, if Trump gets elected, we're going to fill the jail and be able to pay our bondholders and keep our county jail open, which is exactly what happened. So that's Glades. And like I said, like the broader context matters. One, following the money can be very helpful. But in the case of Glades, for example, it's not like the county is getting stacks of money from all the revenue from ICE, right? What they got is a new jail facility. And who gets the money are the investors in the jail, right? The bondholders, just like an investor in a college or an investor in any sort of public infrastructure would get. But it's important to follow the money and like to make those distinctions. And it's also, I think, important to follow the political investment in some of the rural counties. So what I find interesting about Glades is, okay, even if the county is not profiting directly, they did invest in creating a bunch of jobs for their sheriff's office. And there is a certain political investment now where you have county commissioners concerned about getting more ICE detainees, right? Like county commissioners who, before this project, in the case of the county commissioner I'm thinking about, now he's concerned about ICE detainees and paying off the bonds for this massive jail. Before that, he was running an after-school program for children to work in agriculture, like with animals, for example. So it's sort of like, why are the county commissioners of Glades County concerned with immigrant detention at all, right? And so for me, that's part of the story. It's like there's a financial investment in some of these rural areas, and which leads to a certain political investment in whatever it is, law and order, increased incarceration, in this case, increased immigrant detention. So I'm going to sit down now, but I guess if I want to leave you with anything, it's sort of to try to look at jails as more of a social and political and economic problem that is wider, and to try to trace linkages between different levels of government and follow the money. And I mean, to the extent that you can, right? And less of like, I would argue to look at them as social problems and not necessarily technical issues. Although there are technical solutions to some of this jail incarceration, I think that there's a lot to be said for the broader context and following that out. So thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Steve, could we have the lights up? Because we won't have PowerPoints from the others. And because these presentations are fairly disparate, I thought I'd give you the opportunity to ask Jack questions now if anybody had the pain of an unexpressed thought or a question. Yes, right here. Let's get a microphone first so we got it for all the video recording.
Kyle Looker from the Centerville, Iowa Daily Iowegian. You kind of touched on it a bit. I just want to kind of cement the methodology and the data. So let's say in a hypothetical, County A arrests somebody, charges somebody. They book them, but they don't have room in their jail. They get shipped to County B. Yeah. Which county is that inmate counted in the data?
Probably going to be County B.
Okay.
Yep, and thank you for asking that, because that is a big thing to look for in this data, right? In some counties more than others. And if you go through the map, you definitely need to know where you're studying, you know, and that's where that context comes into play. So like Utah, for example. Utah holds state prisoners at the county level that are often counted in that data. So if you look at Utah, you'll see like some counties have extremely high jail incarceration rates, like Daggett County, Utah. Doesn't really make sense, but if you know a little bit about what goes on in Utah, it does. So that's why the local knowledge is key to using the data. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep. Ben here in the center. If you could pass the microphone to him.
Kind of similar to that question. I was looking at my county in Kentucky.
Yeah.
And there's a jail that serves two counties. Mm-hmm. So all the prisoners from one county go to the other county. So the county without the jail has a 0 rate.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the rates on the county with the jail are based on that county's population and not the other county's population?
Yeah. That's a problem. It's not a problem. I mean, that...
Well, with the regional jails, we attempted to disaggregate it to the Peter County space, unfortunately on the county size. It's sort of deep in the notes. It's West Virginia and Virginia in particular is really hard to work with the regional jails.
And in Kentucky, we've got 120 counties, and 41 of them don't have jails. So, and they may send their inmates to 6 or 7 different counties. Typically, they have a contract with one, but they can go most anywhere. Any other questions? I had a question, Jack. Exactly where do these data come from? And how often are they updated? How reliable are they?
Chris, do you want to speak to that? Chris put the data set together before I got there.
Okay, we'll listen to Chris.
So the data is from the Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics. They send an annual survey to the largest jails in the country and a sample of the smaller jails. So we have very good data on about 800 jails each year. It usually takes them a couple of years, frankly, to get it out. So we're only at 2015 data right now. We're waiting on 2016 today and 2018. They only care about counts and custody numbers, so they don't care where the person is, like the jurisdiction. So they don't make any attempt to figure out where the people in jail are from. So we can't answer the question you're asking with the data we have from then. So we're looking for other approaches there. And a large issue that we have with this data that some of you will notice as you look at your own counties and if you're from rural places is they only collect data from smaller counties every 5 or 6 years. And so the most recent data available for small counties, for most rural counties, is 2013, which is, of course, a huge problem because, 5 years ago was an eternity in the life cycle of a jail. So things may have turned a corner positively or negatively since 2013. So it really requires you to look to your local jails data. Fortunately, many jails have data on their website. fortunately for journalists, you can get inmate rosters pretty easily in most jails. And if they don't, you can call them and they'll tell you. So it's pretty easy to get this information. It's just a phone call or a couple clicks away to verify what you're seeing on the website.
Hi, I'm Deborah Berry. You talked about following the money in the business of jails. I don't know, I know that you had the stats, but were you able to find out or determine whether a lot of the counties are building prisons for census related, especially since that will be more revenue and more money, more? Is there any way to track or explain that as a factor?
It's hard. I haven't tracked it at at a nationwide scale. But yeah, I do think it's important to follow the money, and I want to add follow the money in the sort of political investment, because a lot of the times, the money won't make sense almost within it's not like a county might not just be making money, but they might be they won't have profit in that way, right? But they might offset their budget. So it's in order to really follow the money with jail or to make it make sense, I really think you have to look at what are the political investments of the actors in the county, and it really varies,
One thing to remember on the census angle is that the census reports separately people living in group quarters. So if you want to break out that inmate population, you can look at that number on the census report. It shows up in the basic census data on the websites. Any other questions for Jack? Okay. We're going to hear from Kristine Phillips. She's a reporter for the Washington Post. She's here today because of her experience in Indianapolis, Indiana, where she covered criminal justice, major criminal trials, and civil cases, and was part of a team that won awards for news coverage. And she's written extensively about wrongful conviction, started a series that explored the lives of people who were wrongfully convicted, and produced stories that took a critical look at state laws and how they affect the lives of people in the criminal justice system. She also reported on a series of reforms by the state legislature, which I think had the effect of putting more responsibility onto the counties for corrections. So talk about your journey through criminal justice reporting.
I spent about 4 years up until 2016 covering criminal justice in Indiana for the Indianapolis Star. And around 2013, I started hearing a lot about this criminal code reforms. It's apparently the largest reform in Indiana in 3 decades. And it's billed as this... we're going to move away from incarcerating nonviolent people and the mentally ill and people with substance abuse problems. We're going to move away from that, and we're going to fund all these programs and mental health treatments and substance abuse counseling and other alternatives for just incarcerating them. That was 2013. And so I wrote a series of stories that looked at this, and one thing I've heard over and over from sheriffs in some of the most rural counties in Indiana. In Indiana, there's only about 4 counties that are considered big. Majority of the state are very rural, very small, and what I've heard from a lot of the sheriffs is that they are really, really anxious that they're going to get inundated with all of these low-level felons. In Indiana, it's felony 1 to 6. 6 is the lowest. And what they're fearing is that they're going to be inundated with all these low-level felons, and who are then going to have to serve time in jail. And most of these people will have some kind of substance abuse problems or an underlying mental illness that they are trying to self-medicate for. So, and none of them are equipped to deal with what they fear would be a huge influx of people. That was, I think, 2015 when I wrote a story just focusing on this overwhelming fear of jail overcrowding. 2 hours ago, preparing for this panel, I talked to the same sheriff that I talked to a few years ago, and we had he basically said, well, we're inundated, we're severely well-equipped, we don't know what to do. We are inundated with these surveys from organizations asking us questions like, what services do you provide for people with opioid addiction problems? Do you have psychiatrists in your jails? And what he said to me was, direct quote, "Are you expletive kidding me?" Because we're not, if there's one cardinal rule about jails is that we're not here to rehabilitate. The jails are not here to rehabilitate. They're not here to for people to serve their sentences for long term. And when I say long term, it's 1 year. 1 year in jail is long. And this is from a county in Franklin County, Indiana, a population of 22,000 people. Their jail capacity is around 70. Right now, they're overcrowded. They have people sleeping on floors. So I guess the takeaway is, few years, this criminal justice reform was, I want to focus on, I guess, I want to focus first on the positive impacts of this. So in terms of the positive, and I think this is something that you can also see in other states, not just Indiana, is that there has been kind of a shift in paradigm from a mentality of incarcerating people who are mentally ill to treating the underlying illness or treating them. So that has been, I guess, the major accomplishment. The state legislature of Indiana has been focusing on funding, because for these reform to actually make some significant impact, you have to keep creating these programs for people. You have to keep funding them. And that's really about the extent of it from what I've heard. The negative impact is, if you talk to sheriffs in Indiana, you will see that, one, jail overcrowding. I actually saw some statistics here. So in 2013, 48 jails out of about 90 in Indiana were over capacity. In 2016, that's 57 out of about 90 jails in Indiana are over capacity, and that's after the criminal code reform had already taken into effect. Let's see here. And I wanted to go back to Franklin County. I like to use Franklin County as kind of an example, because if there's one thing about being in jail, or if there's one thing about low-level felons in jail, most of them are going to be mentally ill. And case in point, with Franklin County, they don't have any of those services for mentally ill. The sheriff of that county, when I talked to him today, he told me a story about this one man yesterday who was biting his arm really aggressively because he was trying to get to his vein and he was trying to commit suicide. So what happened to him? He was sent to a facility where he will be on hold for 72 hours, and then he will be back in jail, where he will eventually come out worse than when he got in there. And where the extent of mental health services that one could get is some basic medication, a couple of hours of a meeting with a mental health counselor every week, and that's it. So now we're talking about the very same things that some of these county jails have said are they're fearing is going to happen 4 years ago, is that we're going to be inundated with all this stuff that we're not equipped to deal with. for jails. Jails are for people who are awaiting trials, pretrial detainees. They're not there for people who are serving sentences or long sentences. They're not there for people who need medication on a day-to-day basis, expensive medication and treatments on a day-to-day basis. And then, sorry, just one more thing to add.
Go ahead.
And then in terms of state funding, last year, the state passed a bill that would basically allow Indiana counties to, that will basically allow them to raise property taxes so they can build another jail. So I guess that's kind of what I see is the irony of this whole thing is that years ago, Indiana wanted to shift from this incarceration mentality. But really what happened was shifting prison incarceration to jail incarceration, which if there's a big difference between jail and prison, jail doesn't provide long-term services that people used to get in prison, like re-entry services or job treatment or job training. They're there to just house them for a certain period of time, and then they get out with no job skills, no treatment that they needed, and then they're back out in the community, and they are going to be likely to reoffend. So.
You covered the debate on this in the legislature. Didn't they know what they were doing?
Well, it's tricky because I talked to the two of the main authors of this, that was spearheading this reform, and what they have promised, over and over is that, funding. We're going to fund these mental health programs. We're going to fund these facilities. We're going to do all that. But when I talked to the local sheriff today, we have no funding. We have no money. We're just, like I said, they were asked this survey constantly about, what services do you have? How much more money did you get? Well, what they're saying is that we're barely scraping by. So one thing that's kind of obvious here is that yes, there have been funding, but it's not enough. It doesn't even come close to answering this problem of a lot of people in the community who need long-term treatment.
So when they talked about increasing funding, they did increase it somewhat, but not enough.
No, and they didn't. What I've been hearing is that it wasn't enough for at least these jails who are going to get a lot of these people. And one thing that's also lacking, as I can tell, is that there's not enough long-term funding for mental health facilities. You have funding for certain programs to fund certain programs for a year or two, but not long-term for to build, a mental health facility where people could stay.
Okay. What lessons did you learn in your reporting about this subject, both at the local level and at the legislature, that might help some of the reporters in this room follow the subject where they live and work?
So in terms of finding people to talk to, the challenge really is, if there's anything about criminal justice reporting that I've learned is as a reporter, you need to find the human face in every statistic. You need to find the human face in every statistic about jail overcrowding. It's easy to get wrapped up in statistics and policies, but without having a subject or like I said, a human face that a reader could identify with and really realize that this is, a person, a real person that will be affected by this. It's hard to make a story compelling. And so what I try to do in my reporting is to really find the person that will be impacted by this so that, you can make the case that, hey, this is something that you should read. This is something that is not just spitting out complicated, convoluted policies.
Do you think that readers in general are interested in reading stories about people who have fallen on misfortune partly through their own fault and may not have much sympathy for them? How does that equation work?
That's a difficult question to ask, difficult question to answer because part of my I've been working for the Washington Post for 2 years, and with every story that I write, I know how many people read it, and if there's anything I could say about readers love to learn about what horrible crime a person committed. Readers love to learn about this weird, just out of the box crazy crime. It's just the page views always just go through the roof. But when you try to humanize someone who committed crime, when you try to, explain that a person who committed crime is not, just a bad person, it's a person whose life intersected with the criminal justice system and who will forever be part of the criminal justice system. It's tricky. Like I'm still trying to learn how, to cover these kinds of stories that readers would be interested in.
Because drugs are such a big part of this problem, and I think people are increasingly realizing that it's a health problem, not just a criminal justice problem. Is that a good way to get into these stories and point the finger at the drug issues?
Right. Now that you mentioned that, I wanted to bring attention to this. The Cincinnati Enquirer a couple of years ago, last year, won a Pulitzer for local reporting for their reporting on the heroin epidemic in Cincinnati, in the Ohio area, and what they did was they reported on the heroin epidemic not as something that people should be scared about. They had practically the entire newsroom following these people who are suffering from addiction in the court hearing, lining up to go to jail, and they've really done a great job of portraying these people as not just criminals. They've done a great job of portraying these people as people with legitimate, significant problems that really incapacitates them on a daily basis. So if there's a great example out there, it would be.
It is a great example, and it took things from the abstract to the very real and practical. The title of the series was 7 Days of Heroin.
Right.
And they just followed all the people involved, all the types of people involved in this problem. And, some of the stories were fairly mundane, but it really, I think, brought a greater understanding of what the day-to-day reality is. You were writing about a policy subject and a public issue, but in a way that humanized it in a different way than a profile would. You did focus on one particular individual. It was this huge population, really, of individuals that drove home the point that, listen, folks, there are all kinds of people in all walks of life doing all kinds of things that are part of this problem. And I think what it did was make it more of a community issue.
Right.
The people in the Cincinnati area and northern Kentucky realize that it is a big issue, but I think that that series did a good job of bringing it home. So
Right.
I'm glad
And
you mentioned that.
It's not a complicated story to write. All they did is just be there as it happened, and they were able to write it in a really powerful way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions for Kristine about her reporting? Yep, over here.
Kristine, so in Indiana, so was it sentencing reform? Was that the primary? Was that the bulk of the criminal justice reforms that took place in Indiana?
Right. Yes. It's yes. I guess you can definitely call it sentencing reform. Yes, they passed this massive bill. I think in 2013, and before they even got there, they had years and years of debate. And yeah, so like Indiana got to a place where they were at the risk of having to build a new prison because of prison overcrowding. And the politicians there finally realized, well, we can't build a new prison, so we really need to really hunker down and figure out how to do this. There's one thing that I wanted to add. Part of the Indiana criminal justice reform is that, one part is low-level felons will no longer be sent to prison. But the other component of it, too, is that prisoners who were convicted of really violent crimes, from a level 4 felony up to a level 1 felony, will have to serve more time. So from 50% of their sentence to 75%. So what we're seeing now is, yes, a prison population did go down sometime in 2015, 2016. But right now it's creeping back up because you have people serving longer time. You have more people serving longer time. Right now it's below the prison population statewide is below 30,000 people. What people fear is that it's going to creep back up.
And one follow-up question, Steve, if you'll give her the mic.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say, so we experienced something very similar in Utah, and it was just maybe a couple of years after that we passed some sentencing reform, and which essentially caused this trickle-down effect. Instead of people going to prison, they were going to jail. Right. And I know Vera just came out with a report recently that showed a shift from incarceration rates in prison to jail. Is that linked?
Oh, sorry. Linked to what?
I'm talking to Jack. Do you know, is there a link between sentence reform and the shift from prison to jail that's happening nationwide?
Nationwide, I don't know.
Maybe not nationwide, but in a lot of places.
Definitely need to look at it state by state. And yeah, I mean, Utah is an interesting example. I just came back from Indiana yesterday as well, looking at the same thing where it's like, sometimes you have, I guess I would call it like a devolution, like state prison reform as devolution. Where you have reforms that basically push people down to the county level and push those costs down to the county. But how that plays out varies a lot. And that's one of the things that we try. I mean, the report that I think you're talking about is called The New Dynamics of Mass Incarceration, and I would encourage you all to take a look. But there definitely needs more in-depth research to figure out what is going on with some of those trends that we're seeing. But, yeah.
Comment from Charisse.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a data point that I usually share, which is only about 6% of the arrests per year actually move on to state prison. So when we talk about most of the criminal justice punishment that's happening, it is happening at the state level. If you look back at California's realignment, which is the word before devolution, the California anyone from California in the room? The California jail systems were already full and mostly full of people in a pretrial detention status. So Indiana is a great example of taking on a criminal justice topic where you want to say, well, is the issue of prison, people previously going to state prison are now flooding the local jails. But if you look at the local jail, if 90% of the people in the local jail are there pretrial and 85% of those 90 are there because they can't afford a money bond, then we should not be talking about building new jails. We should be, as reporters, you should be asking the local jurisdiction, why do you have so many people in here who are simply just too poor to post this bond? Because if you could remove 30%, 40%, 50% of the jail population, you could take people at the local level. People should be serving time close to home. That is a research-based kind of component to this. So we should be talking about how to make room at the local level, how to improve the conditions at the local jail so that you can have programming if, in fact, people are going to be staying close to home. So I just don't want it to connect like, Ohio has a ballot measure coming to remove some felonies down to misdemeanors. It would be a shame if it was now said that, well, we need to build more jails in Ohio to accommodate people at the local level without taking on the money bond issue, because in Indiana, it's the Indiana State Association of Bail Bondsmen who are perpetuating the money bond system to ensure that the jails stay full of pretrial defendants.
And I just wanted to add about the bail bond industry. I spoke with the head of the Public Defender Council a couple of days ago, and yes, majority of people who stay in jail are pretrial detainees. So it's like the irony of keeping people in jail because they're poor. They can't afford. If someone who's charged with theft, their bail is $3,000. Someone who's charged with murder but is rich can easily go out and just pay the bail. Well, that's not really, that doesn't go with public safety, because you have the more dangerous felon out there, more dangerous person out there, but not the poor one who just couldn't afford anything.
Great. Thanks for that comment. We're going to move on to Juleyka, and she is the producer of 70 Million, a podcast chronicling the criminal justice system and reforms around the country. Talk about that and other work that you have done in this area, especially when it comes to rural places.
Sure. Hi, everybody. 2 years ago, I was a fellow. It feels really nice to be here. So congrats. This is a really great program. When I did it, we were focused on youth. And I did some of my best reporting after coming out of here and just being like, what? I have so many questions. I have so many leads. They're like, you're going to get that roster of people. I literally emailed every single one of them. And so they really mean it when they say, call me, email me, I want to support you. And then the center was tremendous in, I would just call and be like, I want to talk about this. Who do I need to talk to? Or I'm looking at so-and-so in Alaska or whatever. So they really mean it. They will do that stuff for you. And I'm so proud of the work that I did. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, I love data. I love Vera. Vera and I have a great, loving relationship. Not with him. Let's be clear. But Vera, I actually got the embargoed version of that map 2 years ago, but I'm just showing off now. Sorry. But actually, I'm going to make a point about that, too, because you want to get the embargoed version of the Vera stuff. Okay, you really, really, really want that. Because what happens is that if you're among the first to raise your hand and say, this sounds awesome, let's talk about it, they will put the researcher on the phone with you for as long as you want, and you can ask them all kinds of annoying questions that they will very gracefully answer. And then they will say, you know what? I don't have an answer for that question, but I'm going to pull that data for you, and they will cross-reference stuff for you. And so Vera is amazing for that stuff. But I wanted to give you a different way to think about your reporting endeavors. Some of the work that has been the most meaningful for me, and actually some of the work that has changed policy, has come out of me writing myself a Post-it note and putting it on the side of my computer. It's usually a question. And that's what happened with the proposal that I pitched to get into the fellowship 2 years ago, which was I was interviewing someone who'd come out of jail, and he mentioned to me that, he's an adult now, he's an advocate for the incarcerated, but he mentioned that one of the consequences of him having gone to jail as a teen was that he completely lost his brother. His brother is super successful, wants nothing to do with him, right? And so I wrote on a Post-it, what happens to the siblings? And I just put it there on my computer. And that question just kept gnawing at me because I had, as a criminal justice reporter, I had never asked myself, what happens to the siblings, right? I'm too busy focused on the defendant and the team around him and the system around him or her. And so I just let that question kind of stare back at me from the computer until I started doing some research on probably sometime when somebody canceled another interview on me. I just sat and I was like, okay, I have an hour. Let me go do this. And then I learned that we in the United States didn't have any information on what happens to siblings. The UK actually has the most up-to-date, and they regularly update the information. So I dove deep into what was going on in the UK to understand the trends, to get the vocabulary. And then I just started digging in the United States. So I ended up pitching that investigation to the fellowship, and after ended up doing a 6-part series on what happens to the siblings of the incarcerated. And to this day, I get emails from defense lawyers saying, I used part of your reporting in the testimony, or I used it in part of the dossier that I prepared for the judge, blah, 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 because there is such a depth of information. So this Post-it note method really works. And there's I'm going to give you 2 other very clear examples of that. So my goddaughter, who's beautiful and artistic and wonderful, was applying to colleges 3 years ago. And she calls me up and she's like, why are they asking me if I have a criminal record? And I was like, who's they? Who have you been hanging out with? Where are you right now? Right? I'm like, let's back up. And she's like, I'm filling out the Common App, and there's a question about criminal justice. And I'm like, read me the question. So she reads me the question, and the question is basically, have you ever previously been disciplined by your high school, or do you have a criminal record, right? It doesn't say this question is optional, right? Which in theory, all questions are optional. Just as a philosophical stance, right? Which is what I said to her. I was like, don't answer that, obviously. Like, I know that you don't have a record, but like, it's not their business, right? But then, again, posted, I was like, why the blank is the College Board asking kids for their criminal justice records, right? And that led me down a rabbit hole of asking all the grown-ups who made this decision, to the point, and I don't suggest you do this, to the point that the woman at the comms person at the Common App kept ignoring me. I just blasted her on social media. And I was like, hi, I know who you are. I've been trying to get in touch with you. And I gave her all the timestamps of when I've been leaving her messages. So the next morning we talked. Again, don't do that. Don't do that. And so it turns out that the 800-plus colleges that utilize the Common App just sort of like don't think about it. Somebody put the question on it, and they were like, well, wasn't me. And then it got personal because Boston University, where I went to school, asks the question. Because, of course, I was like, let me check. Did I go to a school that does that? So I called Skidmore, I called BU, and Skidmore doesn't, but BU does. And then I learned that Massachusetts requires all colleges and universities within the state to ask the question. So then I just had a bunch of more questions, right? And Washington does the same thing, right? And so what ends up happening, I write this piece in The Atlantic where I'm like, what the blank is going on here? Why are we asking these kids about this? And then look at what happens. You know, the State University of New York is losing 34% of applicants at literally this question, right? Because there was CAS, an organization in Syracuse that was tracking this stuff, right? So guess what? The College Board dropped the question. It dropped the question, starting with the academic year 2017. Right? And that was a Post-it note question, right? Same thing, last example, but I want you to understand, like it's really actionable. Like when your instinct clicks in and you're just like, something doesn't fit here, I'm not liking this answer, follow that. Really follow that, because this happened again after this investigation, because then I was like, oh yeah, I'm on fire, right? Like, there is no dumb question I cannot find an answer to. With my editor's consent, please be considerate of your editors. They're very hard to talk. And so, sorry. So then I called. So that was one of them. Oh, and then also, of course, the Secretary of Education took credit for that, because 2 months after I did that investigation, he announced that he had 100 colleges that had volunteered to take an oath not to ask those questions. And they had this big reveal in California where 3 of the sources in my pieces were there. But, I'm not mad. It's fine. Whatever. But they did give me the scoop. They called me to give me the story. So I was able to publish the story literally the same hour that they made the announcement. So I was like, okay, we're even. It's okay, I forgive you. But the last thing that happened, similarly, again, just like trust that knowing feeling. So I was talking to some kind of advocate in New York City about something, I don't remember. And he mentions that one of the things, and it's an advocate for returning citizens, that one of the things that they have the hardest time with is getting these folks IDs, right? Like getting them a state issue ID. And so he's explaining this to me. And so, sort of like really basic, I'm going, wait a second. Wait. Because the federal government has proof of these people's identity, right? Because they want to make sure they put the right person in jail, right? Right? So when the federal government, which has, all of the proof in the world that this is the person they've incarcerated, sends them back out into the world, they don't give them an ID. And the guy was like, nope. And I was like, okay, I'll be right back. I'm going to call you later. So I called the State Department. And then I called the Bureau of Prisons. And I called everyone. Basically, I almost had Loretta Lynch on the phone because I was like, I'm not getting the answers that I need. I don't understand, right? Because first, I tried the dumb way, and this is not something that you should do, but it does help sometimes when you're a reporter and you play dumb. So I call the office. I'm just telling you, you have to. So I call the office that issues passports because I'm like, federal government, federal prisoner, that's a federal ID, everybody will accept it. If they have a passport, then they can get a driver's license. So I was like, okay, we start with the passport. Talk to the guy on the passport. He's like, ma'am, the person would have to provide proof of birth in order for us to issue a birth certificate. So I'm like, bet, I'll call you back. So I call the Bureau of Prisons, and I'm like, hi, do you guys get proof of birth before you put people in jail? And they're like, of course we get proof of birth before we put people in jail. And I was like, great, be right back. So then I call, literally this is over like a 4-week period, and this is what I was doing. And I would literally get the transcript from the conversation, get back on the phone with the State Department and go, I don't know, because I called such and such deputy, at the Bureau of Prison, and he said, and I quote, yada, 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 yada. And so that's not really vibing me with what you're telling me now, right? So for about a period of a month, I played all of these departments against each other until a very high-up person called and was like, what do you want? And I was like, I just want to understand why, if you have all the information that is required to give these people an ID, you don't give them an ID. And I have not gotten a satisfactory answer. The Federal Bureau of Prisons now issues IDs to everyone who leaves their custody. Seriously. But it just took me annoying the hell out of them for that to happen. And so also trust those things. The data is really, really important. But sometimes following that sort of like that gnawing feeling that something is off is really important. Again, I'm going to do my shameless plug. I put these on your table. This is a new podcast that's going to launch August 27th. And it is doing, hopefully, all of the things that they said to do, which is to go local. So we've sent 9 producer reporters with recording kids and the works into 9 different communities, from small, rural, all the way to big cities. We're going to be in Philly, actually. And the idea was to go look at what are local people doing to solve these problems that affect them more than anyone else, and that are not theoretical for them, but that are really, really practical. It's costing them money, it's costing them resources, et cetera, et cetera. And so we decided that we wanted to sort of attack some of the universal themes locally. So we're going to be looking at bail reform. We're going to be looking at women, which is the fastest growing population of people in jails. We're going to be looking at pretrial diversion. We're going to be looking at youth coming out of the foster system, because a very high percentage of them end up entangled in the criminal justice system. We're going to be looking at technology, particularly bracelets, ankle bracelets, and then we're going to be looking, there's a bunch of, obviously 9 or 10 things we're going to be looking at, but the idea was to just go see what people are doing. And there's some really cool things that are happening around the country. So, for example, in East Baton Rouge, they have these committees now, and the sheriff is in the committee, The DA's rep is on the same committee, and a public defender is in the committee, and a social worker is in the committee. And so they basically assess each person individually coming in through their system to figure out whether they should be diverted from mental health services, or whether they should go face a judge, or whether if it's a youth, whether they should be sent to some kind of rehabilitation center, things like that. So that's one thing that's happening that's really promising. In Boston, someone bravely decided to finally try out heroin clinics where people can go in and do their drugs safely and monitored and have equipment to do it properly. And at the same time, they get some counseling and things like that. And so that's really promising.
So what small towns and issues are you looking at in this podcast?
Okay, that's a good question. So we're looking at the increase, thanks to Vera, discovering that small jails are growing the fastest, right? And so that's a big concern. And we're also looking at why it is that now the new cottage industry is going to be, derived from ICE detention. And so that we do have smaller counties interested in getting funding from ICE to basically build a holding facility for them. And so that's another issue that we're looking at. We're also looking at the tug and pull between the sheriff and like the mayor and the county, because often they have very different ideas about what needs to be done. And so there's a friction, there's a really important friction there. But yeah, so we're looking at a lot of global issues very, very, very locally. In I think Pima is where, in Pima County, I want to say. Forgive me, but I have
Arizona.
Yeah, in Pima, Arizona. So in Pima, Arizona, there's a rural community where they're basically being guinea pigs for this one producer of high-end ankle bracelets. And it's because the company was given some kind of deal by the county. And so we're like, something's amiss here. So let's go look at it. But there are all kinds of things happening at the local level that were, sort of like pushed to the forefront by local actors, which is really good.
So where are you getting these story ideas? What are the sources these people can call to get tips like that?
Okay, so Vera, I know this is like... so Vera's great. We also looked at what MacArthur was doing, obviously, because we wanted to be like, hi, we're cousins, we're play cousins, will you play with us, So we looked at what they were doing, and then... I had a lot of contacts that I pulled, and then all of the people who are reporting also do criminal justice as part of their beat, and so we cast out a pretty broad net, and they just whittled it down from there. But there are hundreds of stories that we're never going to be able to tell. So there are a lot of really good stories waiting to be told.
Sure are. Any questions or comments for Juleyka?
Kyle Oker from Centerville, Iowa again. I guess when you talk about jails, we almost always immediately start talking about mental health as well. So how do you get around HIPAA issues when you're requesting data or information from departments?
HIPAA issues, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really, really great question. They're not going to give you that's not where you're going to get the answer. So graduate students are really good at this because and some of my best sources have always been graduate students and their professors. So that in case you guys haven't discovered that treasure trove, there are grad students in the criminal justice space doing really, really great work. I did a piece on a study coming out of Texas where this person literally went through every single record of an in-custody death in Texas and found out that over 3,000 people had died in custody in a very short period of time. And she sent a query into the Atlantic to see if they were interested, and it was sent to me because it was criminal justice, and I called her immediately. And she had a copy of every single record. And then she created this database, right? So grad students are great for that. So if you're looking for stuff on mental health, I would say dig around, see if anybody is doing a study that looks at that, because they might have requested the individual records or the hospital records or some other way that then you can use to extrapolate data. It's going to be more difficult for you to get it as a reporter.
I think that's a very good suggestion. There are lots of people in this country who make their living, gain tenure and promotion by doing research that might get published in what one Kentucky governor once called itty-bitty journals. But sometimes those itty-bitty journals have really valuable information, and they may have been mining this data for years, and now it's finally gotten to a critical mass where people are paying attention, and that data may be available. So I would recommend Google search for academics, for example. You can search these scholarly publications and come up with not just the articles themselves, but the people who wrote them, and track them down. No telling what kind of research they've done lately, and sometimes it doesn't always get published, or it doesn't get published in a widely read journal. So another great avenue for your reporting. Other questions, comments?
Hi, Paul Kuno-Booth from the Keene Sentinel in New Hampshire. I was wondering if there are any good sources of data for post-release supervision, probation, parole, that kind of thing, like county-level numbers, state-level numbers.
Like how many people are on parole versus how many people are scot-free? Like what's the question?
Or just sort of raw numbers. And this is, I guess, for any of you. But, how we have county-level incarceration numbers. I was wondering if there are county-level number of parolees in a county or that sort of thing.
No.
I think
There's Measures for Justice has a program which is actually working on that on a county level.
Okay.
I don't know if you know about
But they're
Measures for
new,
Justice.
though. I mean, they're
They've just started. They've only got a finite number of states
Yeah.
that they're going. It depends on county willingness to actually supply the information and their own staff. But you should check their website.
And Larry Mays has the pain of an unexpressed thought.
BJS, every year, I think they're still doing it every year, although they're kind of iffy right now. BJS publishes probation and parole in the U.S., and I think they've split those out and doing separate reports on probation and parole annually. But those are national level data. But they also report by state, but they don't go to county level on those.
Okay, and for purposes of the tape, he mentioned that the Bureau of Justice Statistics has annual reports on probation and parole.
But check up the Measures for Justice website.
a fine little asterisk on that is that BJS and the CIA crime report all depend on self-reported data. You have to be really straightforward about saying that when you are writing, because the last crime report that I dug into was 2016, and only 18% of the 33,000 jails in the country actually had reported for that one, 18%. And so you really have to sort of look at the disclosure data that's in the fine print, or ask one of the people there, because that's really, really important. The other thing is with homicide numbers, because this was the other question that I had, because it didn't give me the answer. I wanted to know, so right around that time when the crime report came out, a private institute in Chicago had just amassed and was about to release this huge online repository of data, public records, and all kinds of files on the police brutality sort of like epidemic that they had in the 70s. And I wanted to sort of overlay national crime statistics with that and some other very highly intellectual thing that I thought I was doing. But what happened was I wanted to understand in the murder reports, in the homicide reports, how many of those were disaggregated by being in police custody. And the FBI didn't have that data because counties didn't specify if it was officer related. Like every county gets to decide whether they put it in there. And so that was another one of those questions of why are they allowed to cherry pick this, right? Like, if we're expected to accept the FBI report as conclusive and national, why is it that we have this major loophole where not every county is required to identify the police-involved homicides, right? And so like, you have to interrogate, you have to question where these numbers are coming from. And you also always have to ask, how representative is the sample that you had? Because 18% by any statistical measure is not a representative sample. It's just not.
Very good point. Other questions or comments? Got time for one more.
Okay, so let's take a quick, shorter break this time than usual, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And please join me in thanking our panelists for a really excellent